Thank you for joining and welcome to another consultation and discussion for the Gender and Safeguards Study related to the Safeguards Policy Statement by the Asian Development Bank. This consultation forms part of the stakeholder engagement that supports the Safeguard Policy Review and Update process, or the SPRU, as you may hear us refer to it as. My name is Azim Manji. I'm your consultation moderator for this session. This is our 14th thematic consultation topic so far, and this is the first in a series of 5 regional consultations and discussions on gender and safeguards. In today's consultation, we are joined by Bruce Dunn, the director of the SDCC department in the ADB, and also by Malika Shagazatova, a social development specialist on gender and development within the Sustainable Development and Climate Change Department at the ADB, as well as by Zainab Al-Bakari, a senior consultant, gender and safeguards, also within the Sustainable Development and Climate Change Department. Both Malika and Zainab have played various roles in the authorship and the presentation of the study as they pertain to the revision of the 2009 Safeguards Policy Statements. Other experts will be on hand for the Q&A session, including Zonibel Woods and Madhumita Gupta, both of whom are also with the Sustainable Development and Climate Change Department at the ADB, and I know they both look forward to engaging with you for the discussion as well as responding to feedback. This is our first gender and safeguard session today, and we have quite a significant number of stakeholders in the room, with 59 of the registered participants not directly from within the ADB, meaning we have significant participation from outside, including 12 from Indonesia, 17 from the Philippines, as well as other stakeholders from throughout Georgia, Pakistan, Singapore, Tajikistan, and the United States. In this consultation, Malika Shagazatova and Zainab Al-Bakri will jointly present the main summary issues related to the study they have prepared on gender and safeguards and the relationship of the study of relevance to the Safeguards Policy Review. From the presentations, we're hoping that participants like you will share your insights on the potential gaps of the provisions and implementation of the 2009 policy, and propose recommendations to ensure the strengthening of the forthcoming or future revised policy. Comments received from this consultation will inform the revision of the ADB's safeguards policy. Before I call upon our speakers, here's a few gentle meeting reminders. As all stakeholders and participants have consented to when joining, the ADB is recording this session for the purposes of preparing a summary of the meeting. It is the intention that these recordings will be available to ADB staff and consultants, and then more broadly to all members of this consultation publicly. If you have any concerns about this, please contact the Secretariat at the email address posted in the chat box. Please remember to join from a quiet, distraction-free area with your microphone turned off when not speaking. During the Q&A session, you may ask questions by typing them into the chat box or raising your hand in the Zoom feature. You'll then be asked by the Q&A moderator, Ms. Zonibel Woods, to unmute yourself and turn on your microphone, turn on your camera so that you can ask your question live. As we're all colleagues here, a gentle reminder to please be respectful to each other. Zonibel Woods and I will manage the time to keep within our schedule, and should you experience any difficulties, IT support will be provided. You may ask for IT support by typing your issue or query into the chat box in any of the languages we are using today. As we're all joining by Zoom, here's a few guidance notes when using some of the important buttons. Aside from English, we have simultaneous interpretation available in Chinese, Bahasa, Khmer, Lao, and Vietnamese. To access the simultaneous interpretations feature, click on the globe icon found on the lower part of your Zoom screen and select Preferred Language. press the mute original audio button so that you can clearly hear the voice of your simultaneous interpreter. For those of you listening in Chinese, Bahasa, Khmer, Lao, or Vietnamese, if you feel any of the English speakers are speaking too fast and you would prefer us to slow down, you can ask the original speaker to slow down by going to the bottom of your Zoom screen and clicking on the reactions button. When you've clicked on the reactions button at the bottom of your screen, you can then press the slow down button, which is two reverse arrows pointing to your left in white. This will let us English speakers know to slow down. We ask that you use your proper name in Zoom for our documentation. Please change your name on Zoom by clicking on the participants button at the bottom of your Zoom screen. Then on the right-hand side of your screen, look for your name. Then click on the More button on the right-hand side of your name. Then click on the Rename button, typing in the name, the agency you represent, and then click OK. If you wish to send a message, question, or share feedback, click on the Chat button. If you wish to comment or raise a question live in the language you prefer, click on the smile icon or the reactions button, and then click on the raise hand emoji. To speak, unmute yourself, and then click on the microphone icon. To show your video, click on the video icon. This next slide shows how we value diverse and informed feedback from our wide range of stakeholders. So let me refer you to the slides on ADB's commitment to meaningful consultations. I'm not going to read the entire two sets of slides, but just a reminder that these sets of sessions are being recorded and will be documented and subsequently distributed during and for each event. This allows the ADB to review, consider, and respond to any comments and inputs made. If you wish to opt out of the recording or distribution of the recordings, please contact the Secretariat at the email address at the bottom of the screen or shown in the chat box. If you have any concerns on the recording, the confidentiality, the potential risks, abuse, or any other kind of discrimination during the course of these consultations, please get in touch with the Secretariat, again through that same email address. In this consultation, we have about 2 hours, and here's what we have planned to maximize our time as well as yours. Firstly, Mr. Bruce Dunn will provide some welcome remarks and provide a context for this gender and safeguard study. Mr. Dunn is the director of the Safeguards Division in ADB's Sustainable Development and Climate Change Department. Second, Malika Shagazatova will provide an overview of gender work in ADB, which will frame the discussion and move us forward. Malika is a specialist on gender and development in the Sustainable Development and Climate Change Department. Thirdly, we will follow on the study findings and have a presentation on key issues as delivered by Zainab El-Bakari. Zainab is a senior consultant on gender and safeguards in ADB's Sustainable Development and Climate Change Department. And Zainab will provide us with the findings of the gender and safeguard study that has been co-authored with Madhu Gupta, Malika Shagazatova, and others. Zainab will provide us with the objectives and the methodology for the analytical study on gender and safeguards, as well as the convergence with other MFIs, and then go into the current coverage of gender and associated issues with the safeguards policy statement. After the third presentation by Zainab El-Bakari, we will have part 1 of the Q&A sessions as facilitated and guided by some questions that will be flashed on the screen. This will be delivered and moderated by Zonabel Woods. And after part 1 of the Q&A session, we will have a brief 5-minute break. And when we resume, we will be joined for the second moderated discussion, which is also facilitated by Zonabel Woods. Here, we can share options and have some discussion on how we can better accommodate and consider some of the issues raised by Malika and Zainab on implementing gender and safeguards in Asia and the Pacific. Zonabel is a Senior Social Development Specialist on Gender and Development in the Sustainable Development and Climate Change Department of the ADB. These two parts of the Q&A sessions will run for a total of about 70 minutes, and you may ask your questions and share experiences in the chat box or through raising your hands using the Zoom features as I explained previously. A reminder that you may also ask your questions in English, Chinese, Bahasa, Khmer, Lao, and Vietnamese in the chat box or through raising your hand as previously explained using the Zoom functions. Zonabel Woods will prompt us with guide questions to frame the conversations for the two discussions we will have. Please then join us for a quick event evaluation before turning you back to Bruce Dunn to give us a wrap up and the next steps following the consultation. It's now my pleasure to turn it over to Director Mr. Bruce Dunn for his welcome remarks and contextual overview of the Gender and Safeguard Study. Bruce, over to you, please.
Thank you very much, Azin, and it's great to be here again today. Let me welcome everyone and thank you for joining this consultation today on gender and safeguards. Really critical topic, and I'm very much looking forward to the discussions over the next couple of hours. Let me just start by noting that we do have quite a number of people that are joining this consultation that have joined previous consultations, and that's always great. I really want to thank you and welcome you back. Plus, as always, we do have some new participants joining us today. And of course, we welcome your participation and of course, your experiences and expertise on the topics that we're going to be discussing today around gender. Now, let me just briefly start by giving a bit of an overview on the update to the Safeguard Policy Statement. In particular, targeting people that are joining these sessions for the first time. So for those of you that might have been with us from the beginning, I apologize, you've probably heard some of this before, but of course, for the newcomers, I'd like to just provide a little bit of context there. So firstly, ADB's Independent Evaluation Department completed an evaluation of the existing Safeguard Policy Statement in May 2020. And among other issues, the evaluation highlighted the need to further strengthen the integration of gender issues across the safeguards, while also providing additional guidance and considering issues such as sexual exploitation, abuse, and harassment risks, which were not considered in the earlier 2009 safeguard policy, and for which we need to give more specific consideration. Now, overall, ADB's management endorsed all of the main recommendations of the report, including that we should update and modernize the policy. A process to then update was then launched. This really kicked off around August 2020, and we're expecting to complete the update over about a 2.5-year period. At this stage, we're looking towards an ADB board approval by March 2023, although we may extend that time period if we need longer to complete stakeholder consultations and to reach some consensus on the policy. Now, as part of this process, we've been preparing a series of background studies on various thematic topics, which have been presented through these regional consultations. And there's, of course, one that's been completed for gender. And if you don't already have that, we'll make a link available to that through the chat today. We've also completed already 14 topics, and we've had sessions with our developing member countries, with civil society organizations, as well as ADB private sector clients. And we do a range of group and bilateral sessions with other organizations, such as with multilateral financial organizations. And you can find all of the materials on the previous consultations and the analytical studies on our website. Now, so far, most of the consultations have focused on some of the more core areas for the current safeguard policy related to environment, involuntary resettlement, and Indigenous people safeguards. We're now moving to look at a range of cross-cutting issues, and over the next 3 weeks from today, we'll be looking very closely at gender issues. Now, today we'll be focused more broadly on gender and safeguards. Next week, from the 30th of May, we'll then have consultations on sexual exploitation, abuse and harassment issues, or SERD. And then the following week, we will be doing some civil society consultations around sexual orientation, gender identity, gender expression, and sexual characteristics, or SOGESIC. We'll be providing the links to these additional consultations also in the chat if you haven't seen those already. Now, for today's session, as you've seen through the agenda, we have a series of presentations. We will be covering a range of issues, starting first with an overview of ADB's gender work, including a very brief introduction to ADB's gender and development policy and our Strategy 2030 operational priority for accelerating progress on gender equality. Now, this is very important because it sets out a strategic agenda for supporting, amongst other things, women's empowerment and enhancing gender equality in ADB's operations, in our financing, and in our technical assistance for Asia and Pacific. So it's very much a proactive agenda that is seeking to really improve gender equality comprehensively across the region and in the countries that we work. Now, linked to this, but also somewhat distinguished from it, is our project-focused safeguards, which is more specifically focused on assessing and addressing project-specific gender risks through an assessment process, and then, of course, integrating that into project design or through safeguard management plans. There are links, of course, between the proactive gender work and safeguards, but we need to understand these and look at how the safeguard policy, and most importantly, its implementation, can be strengthened. So there's a lot of important issues for us to consider around the policy itself and the implementation side, and then how we link this more proactive work with the safeguards. So I'm looking forward to discussing these issues with you. As usual, we're here to share, but we're also here to listen. We'd very much like to hear your recommendations about how we can improve our gender work, the gender outcomes from our projects. It's obviously a very critical development agenda. So I'd really like to hear your thoughts today. Now, with that, let me now hand over to our first speaker today. We're very fortunate, actually, that we have a number of colleagues joining from our gender team. So I'll hand over first to my colleague Malika, who will present more details on the ADB gender approach. So over to you, Malika. Thank you.
Thank you, Bruce. So next slide, please. I will start my part of presentation with discussion on how gender is situated in ADB's corporate architecture. The Asian Development Bank first adopted a policy on the role of women in development in 1985. And at that time, the focus was on activities that emphasize women as a special beneficiary target group. Since formulating this first women in development policy, ADB's approach evolved and progressed to a gender and development approach that saw gender as a cross-cutting issue influencing all areas and sectors of social and economic development, elevating gender into mainstream of ADB's development agenda. In 1998, a gender mainstreaming approach was given a formal recognition with adoption of the ADB's gender and development policy, paving the way for gender considerations to be mainstreamed in all ADB's operations, activities, including macroeconomic and sector work, lending and technical assistance operations. One of the important milestones for gender work in ADB was adoption of our first gender mainstreaming guidelines. It was in 2012, where we introduced 4-tier gender mainstreaming and project gender categorization system, which has now become well recognized as an MDB's good practice. Today, our gender work guided by Strategy 2030 and its operational priority 2. We often call it OP2, so if you hear, you will recognize what I'm talking about. And the operational priority to recognize acceleration of gender equality as one of seven, Strategy 2030 recognizes that gender equality is one of 7 operational priorities for ADB work. And in 2019, an operational plan for the operational priority 2 was approved. We also, and I will talk about the operational plan in the next slide. So in 2021, we also updated our guidelines for gender mainstreaming categories, which more explicitly set the quality requirements for project gender categorization systems. And they also used to measure, count, and report on the extent to which gender equality issues and women's empowerment are integrated in ADB projects. These updated guidelines also provide clarity on requirements for all the newer project modalities that ADB now uses. Lastly, new guidelines for at-exit assessment of gender equality results were recently approved in April this year. And these guidelines describe criteria for assessment of gender equality results in project completion reports for both sovereign and private sector projects. Next slide, please. So operational priority 2. The operational plan for operational priority 2 on accelerating gender equality recognizes that gender equality is critical in its own right, as well as it's a critical enabler for realizing our developing member countries' socioeconomic development objectives. The operational plan sets 5 strategic operational priorities for 2019 to 2024. And these operational priorities, there are 5 operational priorities, and these are women's economic empowerment, human development, decision-making and leadership, reduction of time poverty, and resilience to external shocks. The operational plan also highlights 5 key operational approaches, and these are scaling up gender mainstreaming in operations across sectors and themes, integrating SDG 5 transformative gender agenda, enhancing gender mainstreaming and going beyond sovereign operations, so enhancing gender mainstreaming in private sector operations, and tackling multiple gender inequalities through integrated solutions, as well as very important area of our work and the approach is developing capacity of our developing member countries and clients. In the context of OP2, ADB is committed to lift its game to go beyond standard gender mainstreaming and towards integrating a more transformative gender agenda that is closely aligned with SDG 5 and interlinked with the achievement of other sustainable development goals, such as poverty reduction, health, education, decent work, and climate change. Next slide, please. I'll just quickly talk about the ADB's gender mainstreaming system. As I mentioned, the gender mainstreaming is well recognized as a multilateral development bank good practice. It's a 4-tier project categorization system, and it ranges from the lowest category of no gender elements to the highest gender equity theme category. And all ADB projects, both sovereign and private sector, are assigned with one of these categories. The process of gender mainstreaming starts from the very early stages of project development, and the system requires gender analysis and collection of sex disaggregated data to support meaningful and proactive gender designs that would address gender issues, narrow gender gaps, and empower women wherever possible within the project design. Our gender categorization system requires use of Project Gender Action Plan, sometimes we call it GAP, as a roadmap tool for gender mainstreaming and for results monitoring. Gender action plan is required for projects that are categorized as 2 highest gender categories, gender equity theme and effective gender mainstreaming. I think it's very important to mention that gender consideration in mitigations and safeguards measures are required for all projects, irrespective of gender categorization. So even projects that are categorized as NGE will have provisions in this as a part of the safeguards measures to ensure that the meaningful consultations with women and women's participation. There is also an established in-house check and balance system for confirmation of any project's gender category to ensure that threshold quality requirements of the category are met before the project approval. Strategy 2030 also set an ambitious twofold targets to support gender equality through gender inclusive project designs. So in at least 75% of our total operations, projects should be categorized as Gen, EGM, and SGE, gender equity theme, effective gender mainstreaming, and some gender elements. And 55% of ADB projects need to be gender mainstream, so categorized with the two highest gender categories. We also have another target for completed operations. 80% of gender mainstream projects, those that are categorized as Gen and EGM, has to be rated successful in delivering intended gender equality results. And gender performance indicators are part of the corporate results framework, and they are tracked and reported annually. Next slide, please. Okay, as Bruce mentioned, there was a report prepared by independent evaluation department, and the report findings on gender in safeguards policy noted that safeguard policy statement specifically addresses gender in 3 general compliance areas. The first one is the consideration of females as vulnerable group in social impact assessment, gender sensitive consultations, and gender responsive grievance redress mechanisms. The report noted that the safeguards policy and related portions of ADB operations manual have not evolved sufficiently to provide the necessary operational guidance on emerging issues, including, for example, sexual exploitation, abuse, and harassment related issues, both at the work site, but also a broader project impact and risk for communities. The report further notes that there is a need to expand the coverage of the policy to clarify and integrate the safeguards aspects of cross-cutting social dimensions, including labor and working conditions, community health and safety, gender, labor influx and migrant workers, and stakeholders engagement, some of which are currently addressed by other ADB strategies and policies. The report concluded that emerging gender risks cut across environment safeguards, health and safety, gender and social protection, and may require more integrated approach, and the report further stressed the importance of the provisions of sufficient operational guidance. This could be done through operational manuals, good practice notes, and training, of course, for ADB staff and for our clients. Based on the review by independent evaluation departments and its recommendations, we prepared a benchmarking exercise for gender and safeguards, and it was undertaken to compare the existing systems within ADB with the MFI safeguards framework existing safeguards framework of peer multilateral development banks. So I would like to invite Zainab El-Bakri to present the benchmark study findings. Thanks. Over to you, Zainab.
Thanks, Malika and Bruce earlier for the introductions. Okay, so if we can go to the first slide, please. So essentially, the objective of the study that was undertaken was to compare ADB's current policy strategies and practices of work on gender and approaches to those used by peer MDBs. So the benchmarking exercise covered peer MDB safeguard policy frameworks, their implementation structures, modalities, practices, and resources. And it involved identifying gaps, strengths, and weaknesses of current ADB approaches and the kinds of differences that exist between ADB and peer MDBs, and looking especially at what were some of the lessons learned and some of the emerging issues, as well as some of the operational implications of this kind of comparison. Next slide, please. But first, of course, we looked at the situation of gender in the current 2009 SPS. And as a result of this examination, it was found that there was a kind of juxtaposition between the safeguards, within the safeguards, between the aspirational development aspects and what the safeguards are supposed to do. And the document concluded that the SPS specific focus on safeguards is specifically on safeguards and not on broader aspirational objectives. And it was felt that this kind of balance was appropriate. We also found that gender and development issues already received specific and focused attention at ADB, in ADB operations, as Malika said earlier, especially through the implementation of the policy on gender and development and the accompanying operational manual. However, it was found that issues related to gender-based violence, issues related to sexual harassment and sexual orientation and gender identity were absent from the SPS, as well as more gendered aspects of very important areas for consideration, such as climate change and labor. It was felt that gender considerations need to be reflected more clearly in the SPS, and that was necessary to mitigate the gender-specific safeguard risks and enhance gender inclusion in a general kind of way. Next slide, please. So essentially the MDBs that were benchmarked are the following. There's one that's actually missing from the list, but so I'll mention that. So we looked at the World Bank, International Finance Corporation, the European Bank for Reconstruction and Development, the Inter-American Development Bank, the Asian Infrastructure Investment Bank, and the African Development Bank. And in order to sort of facilitate the analysis, we looked at three specific issues. The first issue was whether there was a mention or a commitment to gender equality in the safeguard policy or vision, whether there was specific gender-related provisions in the different performance standards or requirements, and finally, the type of guidance materials that was available for implementation support. Generally, the benchmarking exercise highlighted several gaps in ADB policies, practices, and resources when compared to those used by peer MFIs, especially as regards gender in the context of safeguards. So in what follows, we will look at each of these issues that on which we base the comparison. Next slide, please. So first, regarding the whether there's a mention of gender or a commitment to gender equality in the MFI safeguard policy or vision. In undertaking this, in looking at this particular aspect, we found that the Inter-American Development Bank has both a strong commitment to fostering gender equality in the policy statement of its environmental and social policy framework, and it is the only MFI that has a standalone gender standard. The EBRD also makes a very strong gender equality statement in its environment and social policy, stating that gender is a fundamental aspect of a modern, well-functioning market economy and democratic society, and that the EBRD is committed to preventing gender discrimination and promoting gender equality within its mandate. The AIIB states that it seeks to support projects that make infrastructure accessible to everybody. Its policy statement indicates that it will provide client support to identify potential gender-specific opportunities and risks, and to develop mitigation measures to avoid such risks, including measures to identify and address, in particular, risks of gender-based violence. Next slide, please. Regarding the extent to which there are gender-specific provisions in the performance standards or requirements, the study found that the different institutions vary as to the extent to which they incorporate gender provisions in their performance standards. Generally, we have found that the gender-specific provisions are covered under assessment and management of social and environmental risks, under labor and working conditions, under involuntary resettlement, indigenous peoples, and stakeholder engagement. Among all the institutions we looked at, the IDB had the most comprehensive coverage, with explicit mention of gender considerations across the various standards, in addition to a standalone gender standard, as we mentioned earlier. The EBRD also integrates gender across the performance standard and has a specific focus on labor and working conditions. Both the World Bank and IFC also integrate gender considerations across the different standards, although to a lesser extent compared to the other institutions benchmarked. For the World Bank and IFC, this integration of gender was primarily in the performance standards relating to involuntary resettlement and indigenous peoples. Next, please. Then, as I said earlier, we also looked at some of the guidance material that was provided for implementation support regarding gender and safeguards. The World Bank has developed 3 gender-related good practice notes to support its environment and social framework implementation. There was 1 general on gender and 2 specifically addressing issues of SEAH and SGOI issues. It's important to note that these GPNs are advisory in nature and are not policy, they're not mandatory. The IFC also has a set of guidance notes accompanying the performance standards, and it has several resources that can assist in undertaking gender responsive measures in its projects. For example, providing guidance to companies on how to ensure there's no gender-based violence or there's no sexual harassment, etc. The EBRD also has specific guidance for the different entities with which it deals on how to meet the performance requirements. For example, it has specific guidance to financial intermediaries on how to meet EBRD second performance requirement on labor and working conditions. Next slide, please. Okay, so as a result of this benchmarking exercise that was undertaken, there were several key issues that we felt merited further consideration and which can, in fact, provide a kind of basis for possible recommendations to be adopted eventually by the ADB. So the first one is providing a strong gender equality commitment in the safeguard policy or vision. And this, as we indicated earlier, is the case for several of the other MDBs that were benchmarked, which start with this strong commitment to gender equality and the role of enhancing gender equality in issues such as poverty reduction and so on and so forth. Secondly, and I think that's one of the issues that is currently faced at the ADB, that it is necessary to move towards an integrated social and environmental risk assessment. Currently at ADB, these assessments tend to be divided according to the different safeguards. So there are different assessments for involuntary resettlement, for indigenous peoples, for environment and so on. So most institutions are now moving towards a more integrated social and environmental risk assessment. Thirdly, an important issue, of course, is the extent to which gender-specific provisions are integrated in the different performance standards or requirements, and whether it is necessary to have a standalone gender standard. For the performance standards or requirements, again, we've shown that the degree of integration of gender-specific provisions has varied, but it is something that needs to be worked towards and should be an aspiration for the ADB. Another issue that we felt, I mean, we didn't discuss this in great detail in the earlier slides, but we felt that an increased coordination and synergy between the gender and safeguard teams within an institution and therefore within ADB would provide for a better and more synergistic sort of approach to integrating gender into the safeguards. Definitely, we feel that there needs to be a renewed emphasis on learning and capacity building, especially learning the lessons from previous projects, learning the lessons even from complaints that are presented to a particular institution, and trying to build on some of those lessons to be integrated into the new safeguards, and also continuously placing emphasis on capacity building, both of staff of the institution, but also of other entities, including financial intermediaries, including clients, and of course the borrowers, whether governmental or non-governmental. Just to give an example, at the World Bank, the first time that there was a renewed emphasis on gender-based violence and SEH issues was as the result of a complaint that came through the bank's inspection panel on a particular project where gender-based violence was occurring but was not being taken account by the bank. Lastly, we felt that it is important to, again, in the spirit of capacity building, also to have a glossary and also that the environmental and social exclusion lists must include specific terms and explanations relating to gender and gender-related aspects. I'll stop here and look forward to hearing your questions. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Dr. Al-Bakri, as well as Malika Shagazatova, for your very comprehensive and detailed presentations and the wonderful overviews on the gender issues that you've raised for us all to consider. These presentations offer us clarity and present some of the unique challenges which have been raised by ADB's independent evaluation division publicly and need to be considered in the revision of the safeguards policy by around March 2023, as Bruce mentioned. The performance standards established by the World Bank, the IFC, the IDB, and others have set a very high bar, and the comparators presented will offer us some food for thought on where the ADB will and should pitch its gender and development issues and incorporate its operational policy 2030, and more specifically OP2, within the revision of the safeguards policy statement. We hope we can now get into some of the feedback and provide you, which is the main reason we're here, an opportunity to delve into some of these issues during this Q&A session. Before we get to the Q&A, let me not forget to thank also Director Bruce Dunn for framing and contextualizing this discussion. So let's turn over to the Q&A session, which will run for about 70 to 75 minutes, but there is some flexibility in that. Just to note that should you wish to raise a question or share an experience anonymously, you can send the message in the chat box, but instead of selecting to everyone in the chat, please select that you wish to send your message to either Jennifer de Belen or Niel Aquino, who are members of our team working behind the scenes, and they can repost your question to protect your identity and offer you anonymity. We will now have the first part of our open discussions. There's going to be two parts. So the first part will be moderated and facilitated by Zonabel Woods of the ADB. You will see some guide questions flashed on the screen now, but please feel free to also share your experiences on how the ADB can better target or improve or mainstream gender and related safeguards issues in the related 2009 Safeguards Policy Statement. And a further reminder that you can ask your questions either through posting them in the chat box or through virtually raising your hand in the Zoom feature by clicking on the reactions button at the bottom of your screen in any of our languages, not just English. We also have Chinese, Bahasa, Khmer, Lao, and Vietnamese, and those questions will be translated back for the rest of the audience. So with that, please allow me to turn it over to Zonabel Woods for the Q&A session. Zoni, if you please.
Yes, thank you very much. Hello, everyone, and welcome again to this consultation. We're very happy that you're here with us, and especially because unlike many of the meetings we are often having on Zoom, we actually have quite a bit of time to really spend in discussions. So we look forward to hearing your questions and suggestions over the next 70 or so minutes. So first of all, we will start by opening for statements and sharing of perspectives and recommendations. We have a set of questions also that we are sharing with you. And then we will go through some of the questions that have been sent in advance of our Zoom session. And also we will look at the questions that you have posed in the chat box. So if you have a question, please feel free, or a comment, please feel free to raise your hand and ask away. So I'm just looking to see, I don't see any raised hands at the moment. So if we don't have any hands raised, I will go to one of the questions that we received through Zoom, just to get our conversation started. So I'm just opening my my question that we received through our Zoom registration. One moment, please. So we have a question from Ismael Loganimos. I don't know if you're here with us, Ismael, from Conservation International in Fiji. So the question is, Ismael would like to understand and learn from ADB's Strategy 2030 operational plan for priority 2 on accelerating gender equality. And that makes specific reference to strengthening gender elements in social safeguards. So would you like to take that first question, Malika?
Yes, thank you, Zoni. Thank you, Zoni. To answer this question, I think I need to give a small introduction again, just to clarify the role of 2 policies for the gender work. The first one is, as I mentioned, there is a gender and development policy, the Strategy 2030 and operational plan, which guide our work, as we call it, is do good, that goes beyond do no harm policies that are described in the SPS. So the operational plan 2 provides provides reference to the safeguards in several instances, and one of the very important one is on ensuring that gender elements are strengthened and enhanced in social safeguards in the labor standards. As part of the do good, like our operational priority 2, we are working a lot within the project designs to ensure that women benefit from the job creations, from the opportunities that project generate, both during construction and during operations, which also trigger some elements of do no harm policies to ensure that, for example, women will be paid equally for the equal value of work, that women have access to the sanitation facilities, that women are protected in the construction camps, and women have access to career development and benefits. So that's, I hope this answered the question.
Great, thank you very much, Malika. So we have a question from Go-Ching Shi. You have raised your hand. Please go ahead with your question.
Yes, thank you. And it's a pleasure to join this dialogue. And I joined the ADB activities since mid of 1990. Is I also take the deputy team leader for TA 3441 as a social assessment capacity building in China during 2000 and 2002. The gender is one of the key elements of this TA. So based on my experience and practice, I think this gender is policy is very good taking the leadership by the ADB in the international finance institutions. So I saw the great achievement by the ADB in the past 25 years. So I think this is great. And so for me, I think it's for gender issues, maybe we can divide the two different parts. One is actually some directly impacts for the gender perspective, especially for the woman, and like the project affect the communities, the displaced and the resettlement issues, and also some construction area. So I think it's one of the fundamental requirement is don't harm the vulnerable group, especially for the woman. And this is, I think, is one of the very important fundamental requirement for developer company, for construction company, for all the stakeholders to engage the projects. I think this should be make a very clear message and a very clear standardized with some principle, with some rulers, with some indicators. So this is very, very important because this is directly associated and relevant to the project itself. Especially for the construction period, and also maybe include some preparation and operation period. But the construction phases is most important. So how to formulate some very clear message regarding the standard, the rulers, the principles, some indicators for monitoring. I think this is one of significant important thing. But for those people also try to get some, our gender with development policy. So to benefit sharing, opportunity sharing, for labeling, for some engagement, for participation, the capacity building, and so on. Also associated with this gender issues, but for protecting the woman and especially the vulnerable group. Second part is how to benefit for the woman, and or we can say benefit for gender equity. This is to bring the woman to engage the process of the project cycle with the whole project cycle, and especially I think during the preparation, the gender engagement is to bring the woman and vulnerable group to engage the project identification, planning, feasibility study, design, and how to get the more benefit for the vulnerable group, especially for women. And also during the construction implementation stage, how to engage the women and other the vulnerable group, especially through the labeling and through the some the capacity building, some benefit targeting, and I think this is also very important. But we should maybe some difference between these two parts. Specialized, I think I would like to suggest that, especially for some indicators, like the woman to engage the project construction as a label, how to define, how to statistics this kind of data, and how to arrange these opportunities and some rules is very important. Some of my projects, I think, is too high. The rate is too high, and it's not reasonable, especially for some civil engineering. Okay, this is some of my suggestion.
Yeah.
Okay, thank you.
Thank you so much. And, I also would encourage, if you would like to submit also your comments after this, this consultation in writing, so that we can also, we're recording this consultation, but it's always useful to have it in writing. So thank you very much for your comments. We have a number of questions in the chat. But I would also like to invite the people that have posed those questions to just take the floor and ask the questions. So first we have Krishna from Suarakita. Krishna, would you like to ask your question, or should I just read it out? Oh, please go ahead.
Please just read the question.
Okay.
Thank you.
Okay, sure. Krishna asks if the application of gender and safeguards will be a challenge in a country that still does not have a strong gender protection policy. So I'm just going to read out 3 questions, and then we'll assign them to our different resource people from ADB. From Mari Raselis, and that's a question regarding community-based projects. So assuming your community-based projects incorporate participatory action research, co-knowledge generation approaches, what is ADB's experience in ensuring that affected women's voices are included in the monitor and evaluation process, especially the social impact assessment? And then finally, we have another question from Roland Angerer, who asks who comments that they have found that in most areas of ADB's safeguards, children are an invisible entity, and children's rights are not included specifically in the context of gender safeguards. How are the rights of girls and adolescent women been addressed and protected? So I will turn over the floor first to Malika to answer I suppose that the first question, and then I'll ask Bruce to come in as well. So Malika.
Yes, thank you. Thank you, Zoni. So maybe I'll answer the question from Krishna from the oh, sorry. Okay, sorry. From our gender work perspective, we do recognize that countries are at different stages of developing, but also enhancing and application of the gender protection and gender policies. Some of them are advanced stage, and some of them are kind of still in the process of development. So from the OP2 work, from the OP2 perspective work, we are engaging with the governments in our developing member countries in the policy dialogue to see how we can support gender and development agenda at the policy level work. And there are a number of very interesting projects, policy-based lending, that are coming from different countries. For example, like 2 years ago, we had a very interesting project in Fiji, where we've been incorporating issues related to the time poverty and maternity and paternity leaves. We're also looking with the government to see how we can ensure that the gender responsive budgeting is kind of a core in terms of the development of the government budgets. So from this perspective, in the do good, we will continue working with the governments in supporting the gender and development agenda, and supporting both development of the new policies and the laws, but also supporting implementation, because very often we might have laws and policies that are written, but implementation of these policies and at the national level, at the project level, is something that we need to support. Thank you.
Thanks, Malika. Bruce, do you have anything to add to this question, or may I turn to you for the question from Roland, which really, I think his question is around the inclusion of children in how they're being included in safeguards policy.
Great, thank you very much, Zoni, and thank you so much again to everyone that's joining, and appreciated so far the comments that we've received from Mr. Shi, from Krishna, from Ishmael, and Roland Angara. Really appreciate great points on all fronts. Let me just add very briefly on the question raised by Krishna on how gender and safeguards are a challenge in a country that doesn't have sort of strong gender legislation or requirements, or perhaps just practice, the cultural practices may be a challenge. I just want to add a little bit on that from what Malika has mentioned. Something that we are looking to strengthen at a cross-cutting level in our safeguards is understanding contextual risks. And this is a critical issue actually for gender. In countries, for example, that have weak legislative frameworks, or perhaps a prevalence of gender-based violence in a country, these are issues that, beyond what a project is, understanding that context is going to be very critical. And that needs to inform also things like the social impact assessment, the consultation process, and how robust the safeguards needs to be around that. So that's an area that we were looking to strengthen at a cross-cutting level for our new safeguard policy. Understanding of contextual risks is something that we would bring in as part of a screening and also a categorization process for our safeguards, but then it would flow down through a risk-based approach to how we implement. So that would be a new dimension that we're seeking to bring in with the safeguards. Then next to Mr. Roland Angara. So thank you very much, Roland, for joining today. Actually, I've just written back to you today on a earlier submission that you've kindly submitted as part of a coalition group around child rights and the consideration of children and the safeguards. Really appreciated that. Actually, my colleague Madhumita Gupta in our team is looking at those issues, and I'll pass to her in a moment, who would be able to speak in a little bit more detail. But I'll just mention a couple of brief points. Firstly, we do recognise the importance of addressing both inclusion and risks to children in the process. You're right, I think it hasn't been given enough consideration to date. In theory, the existing safeguards, which does require us to look at vulnerable individuals and groups, should look at vulnerability to children. And in fact, there are project examples where this is considered, for example, risks to children due to construction locations, to noise, impediments to their schooling, could be pollution impacts. These are considered often as part of environmental impact assessments, but it's not explicit in the safeguards, and it's not something that's really, I think, integrated in the way that it could be or should be. So it's definitely an area that we're considering. We've had submissions also from others, including at the governmental level. For example, Australia is pushing very strongly for us to include an approach on protection of children in the safeguards. So we're looking very carefully at that. But let me ask Madhu if you'd like to add any further details.
Thank you, Bruce. And I think that's a very good question. So I would also, draw on what Bruce has mentioned, how are we going to address the needs of the different vulnerable groups in our new policy? As Bruce mentioned, that the first stage would be screening of a project, where we would have an additional layer of contextual risk assessment. So when it comes to, child's rights, child's issues in a project area, we need to be mindful that our project is sited in a geographical location, And obviously it would cover some districts, villages, and we need to assess that in that project area, what are the vulnerabilities that are there? What are the population groups who are there? So the contextual risk assessment and the screening would help us understand that, okay, these are the kind of adverse impacts the project is causing. And this adverse impact might have disproportionate impacts on the various population groups, which might include women, people with different sexual orientation, people, children, small children, adolescent girls. So with that assessment, then the next stage normally that happens is a social impact assessment, which comprised of a house-to-house survey, as well as a lot of focus group discussions around various impacts and how the project design can be improved, what mitigation measures can be in place, and also another way of assessing vulnerabilities. Now, as Bruce mentioned, that the policy talks about vulnerable groups, but it is not so clear. So in the revised policy, what we are trying to do is improve certain things, improve the screening process, have more clarity on provisions in terms of what kind of vulnerability will be assessed, the types of groups that will be covered, and then in the different policy provisions also have appropriate measures for what kind of mitigation measures should be thought for a specific group. Now, having said that, it doesn't say that, you know, SPS is not doing anything about it. If you really look at our loan agreements, we also have a provision on that there should be no child labor in our projects. But having said that as well, it is also important that we are able to monitor that certain things really don't happen in our projects. And sometimes it becomes a little difficult because we have contractors, we have subcontractors, we have also, you know, migrant workers who also come with their children. We also have children who live in the area around it. So there can be issues of, you know, exploitation, as you mentioned, you know, sexual abuse and exploitation. So our next session is also on sexual exploitation, abuse, and harassment, and how we are trying to also deal with it at the corporate level as well as in the SPS. So there are all these pieces of puzzle that will be put together to ensure that we are able to have a wider coverage of vulnerable groups and address the issues that they are faced, and they are protected. And their rights are protected. I'll stop here, Zoni. Over to you.
Thank you so much, Madhu. We also have a question from Mary Raselis in the chat box around participatory action research and how we integrate affected women's voices in the monitor and evaluation processes. Mary Raselis, would you like to come in with your question? Oh, yes, you're there.
Yes.
Okay.
Thank you. Great. Well, I think Ms. Gupta has answered it in part, although if she would like to expand on it, I think that would be very useful, because what just as a background, you know, why I asked the question is I've been at times, you know, consultant to the ADB in Laos, Vietnam, and so on. And we were actively trying to promote, of course, the gender aspects in village consultations. But we would often find that when we got to the villages, they would call the village council, of course, you know, they're registered, a lot of people, and it would be mainly men. Sometimes the women would be there as the women's group of the government, but the women of the community would just be sort of in the background. I noticed that. And so after the session, I would ask, could we just call these women together for informal chats? They had not said nothing up till that time, right? But then when we called them separately, men had left already. They were just a torrent of discussion and assessments and so on. So that's why I asked this question. This was some years ago. And if ADB has really moved progressively, as I think it usually does, in this direction, I mean, I would really like to see how that assurance that women's voices, who are seen as informal when they're meetings, are actually incorporated now?
Thank you so much, Mary, for your reflections and your experience from working on ADB projects. Madhu, did you want to add anything more?
You know, what you are mentioning is, you know, the local context, yes, you know, how people behave. And I do agree with you based on my experience with consultations. Women are a powerhouse of information. I mean, there's absolutely no doubt about it. And if you don't tap them in our projects, it's actually, we don't get what we want in the end. So, in our, normally when we process a project, when we do our documentation for resettlement, as I mentioned, you know, there is a stakeholder engagement plan, although that stakeholder engagement plan in terms of ADB is embedded in the different documents. And a lot of the times you might see just, you know, a couple of pages on that, but actually a whole exercise goes behind that, what you explained at the field level, that you organize these groups and then you get to tap the information from the women. This goes on for sure. And working in projects in a particular country, you're already aware of some of the issues that come up during implementation when it comes to grievance mechanism, when it comes to compensation payments, you know, who should it be given to, what kind of issues they face, livelihood restoration issues, you know, what kind of livelihoods are, you know, most suitable for women. So consultation process definitely takes place, but if our ID evaluation of the SPS, it clearly mentions that we need to strengthen that. So we definitely recognize that we need to get stronger on that. And for that, in our new revised policy, we are thinking of a separate standard for stakeholder engagement. And in that standard, we will also ensure that the voices, the provisions would be there for voices of the women and for anybody, you know, all vulnerable groups, women, irrespective of any population group, to be heard, and their voices and their, you know, and their responses documented and recorded properly. First of all, identification. First of all, finding then methods, how you're going to address them and how you're going to document that process. So we are trying to make this stakeholder engagement process more systematic. Like in the current system, you know, when you have the stakeholder engagement process, you know, scattered in various documents that we have, you sometimes lose the big work that you actually did, but it's not documented well. And it does not synthesize well, you know, for both environmental and social safeguards. So we will have a standard, we will have specific provisions, and we will also ensure there is a documentation to record that. Because first of all, the work that you explained, that is done. And for that, we will have guidance, we'll have training programs for staff as well as for borrowers, as well as the standard would also have some basic provisions that will be there for borrowers to follow. I'll stop there, Sonia.
Can I make an additional comment?
Yes,
Is that
sure.
all right?
Sure. Yes.
Yes, thank you. I think that's very important. I'm just reflecting back on the question about children, very important, that just as a development person for many years, and pushing the issue of gender and women in particular, we have moved from, we always said, well, you know, women are not only mothers. This is many, many years ago. They are also this, and this, economically, this and politically, and so on. And we've been working on the economic and political. But in a way, we got away from her mother part, partly because there's a whole feminist perspective, which is very much, a lot of it is Western based, but in Asia, I think it's very clear. The women basically want to keep a very strong connection with household, family responsibilities and the mother role. And that's why I think sometimes when we try to get women to start in the beginning of the project, what are your criteria for how the success of this in 2 years, what would you like to see? Almost always, I think always, half of their criteria have something to do with my children can finish school, they don't get sick so much. You know, they frame themselves very much in the mother family context. But often we as outside gender specialists actively promoting women outside the household sometimes forget that the women themselves really value that role, although they also want to learn the new roles, but they're always trying to manage both. And I think that's the concept, especially in Asia, that we need to look at very carefully in terms of assessment. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Mary, for your insights on sort of what you've observed on the ground. I know that Bruce and Malika would also like to come in. So Bruce, if I can call on you first, and then Malika, please.
Great. Thank you very much, Mary, for joining again. It's nice to see you. I really appreciated those thoughts. I just add two quick additional things on top of what Marty has said. She's spoken about strengthening the stakeholder engagement process. And as part of that, I think there's two things that are missing, and these have been highlighted so far, for example, in the evaluation process. One is, the tools and the processes for engaging women effectively. Of course, there is a lot of now experience and documentation, but we really need to bring that together in good practice guidance and then help our clients to actually embody that. Unfortunately, I mean, I've seen examples that you just described of women not being in the consultations, and that's not appropriate. But we also just can't assume that doing the same types of consultations at the same time or in the same place will be suitable for women's engagement or, for example, engagement of youth. So, bringing that together, the review of the good practices is going to be critical. And then the documentation, Madhu has mentioned that, but going back to a point that Mr. Shi had raised earlier about indicators. This is really critical because what we see in some of the documentation submitted to us really doesn't give you a good perspective as to whether consultation processes have been inclusive and ultimately, effective. You get broad number of people, number of events. That doesn't cut it, or it shouldn't cut it anymore. So focusing down on the key indicators that can be tailored, of course, to project circumstances, but some consistency that also allows us to monitor. And these are areas I think we have to do more work on and would appreciate partnerships with others as well to make sure we can get that right. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thanks. Malika?
Thank you, Mary. This is just to add, because you raised several very important points, and one of them is the meaningful and proactive engagement with women to ensure that we hear their voices, we understand the concerns, and we can include gender designs that would address these specific concerns and issues that women are facing. And this is something that is very much related to our work and infrastructure development projects, for example, where consultations are not only taking place during the preparation of the project, but also during the implementation of the project. And you would see in ADB gender action plans, often when we plan to have a, for example, woman-only focus group discussion where we want to understand the specific needs that are related to the infrastructure designs. Because if we talk about, for example, road designs or our urban development, projects, it's mostly done by men. Yeah. And when we talk about the public transport, women are probably in majority who are using this public transport. So understanding their concerns is very important part. And we are trying to ensure that for example, in terms of reference for due diligence part in ADB projects, include these specific provisions to ensure that women voices are heard. And during implementation, when we are discussing the designs, we will have meetings organized in the time and the place where will be accessible for women because they have issues related to time poverty, they have issues related to taking care of kids. We have very interesting projects where we're basically inviting women with kids and then having discussion that would discuss with the kids also to understand what are their concerns, because they are also the users. So this is I think just few examples on what we are doing, but again, it's very much country specific. We need to understand the context of the country, so not all the countries, and also sometimes we push to ensure that women are presented in the mixture of stakeholders, because we also want those men who are in the meetings to hear the voices of women. So, and it's very much depends on who is the facilitator of this discussion and how the whole discussion is structured to ensure that women feel comfortable in sharing and discussing. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you.
Thank you, Malika. So we have quite a few questions, some in the chat box, and a few people have raised their hands. I know that Cynthia has been waiting for a while, as has Jayashri. So if I could just call, and we have 5 minutes before the proposed break. So what I would like to do is take the two raised hand questions. So can we start with Jayashri and then we move on to you, Cynthia? And if I can ask you to be brief in your questions so that we have enough time to answer before the break. So Jayashri, please go ahead.
Yeah, thank you. Can you hear me? Are you audible? Can you hear me?
Yes, we can hear you very well. Thank you.
Okay, I have two comments. Of course, it's linked with the other observations made by the others. I know that the ADB and most of the multilateral development banks, they focus more on supporting growth policies in their member countries. And the question and the comments that was made by I think Mr. Shi about the making the right performance measuring indicators is very critical to assess whether the growth policies for which the funding is given is linked with the distribution work that has to happen, so that we see that the opportunities for gender and women are equally distributed, or to distributed amongst the community. Now, my point, what I'm trying to emphasize here, now I know that the ADB and most of the multilateral banks, they promote skill development, particularly the STEM skill development for women, because there is a lot of opportunities coming for jobs in these areas. But at the same time, I know that particularly in many of these construction industries, and the women find it extremely difficult to find job opportunities, particularly in the field of engineering. So my suggestion is, whenever you do some kind of assessments, make sure that how the women are being given, receiving opportunities to work in these projects with their developed STEM skills, so that otherwise, as Mary mentioned categorically, they get the skill, but because of not getting the opportunities, they try to remain in their the social roles like mothers and housewives. So the skills that they have acquired is going to go away. So please see that in your project formulations, you have the right measuring indicators to find out whether these growth strategies are really converted into distribution strategies, and which will bring results for great opportunities for women. Thank you.
Thank you very much for your comment. Very well received and appreciated. And I know that Malika will respond to some of the issues that you have raised, since they are included in our operational plan too, and she can speak to that in a bit. But for now, I'd like to take also Cynthia's question before we ask Malika to come in.
Thank you, Zonabel. Great comments so far, and I appreciate the push on M&E and indicators, and also the nudge to not do things the same way. We can't continue to do the same things over and over again and expect different results. I have a question in two parts, and it brings us back to the study. And I'm new to this process, so apologies if I've missed something. What I thought I heard from the study presentation was there was a clear and sharp look at sort of frequency of how often gender is included and where it's included. But what I didn't hear and what I wanted to probe was, to what extent has the study investigated the nature and the quality of how gender is included? And if not so much yet, can that be done? And just as a quick example, I was a part of a policy review for a sectoral review, and we could see the mentions and we could see it was showing up in the right places, gender and gender equality. But when you lift the lid, we were finding, and I suspect we would also find this in some of the policies reviewed, that they're sort of older framings or empowerment light or gender light framings where we're seeing gender as equivalent to women, or gender as binary, or framings where the language states and frames women as vulnerable, that or frames women as all the same, or that gender involves adding women to, process X, adding women to consultations. And so I wanted to ask, has the study or can the next steps push to compare and investigate those older framings with newer ones that would, for example, explicitly touch on human rights-based approaches, unpacking, shifting from participation to things like informed consent or more specific aspects of gender equality as a human right? And or how has the language and framings shifted towards transformative approaches? I was really glad to see that flagged, and I think it's extremely important. But this is my second question, is it's also really difficult. Understanding transformative approaches in development is hard enough. In relation to standards is really tricky. So I was wondering, can you unpack a bit how you've gotten, where you're headed on that? Is it connected to norms? Is it, or what structural barriers are you zooming in on with that notion of transformative approaches? I will stop there. Thanks so much.
Thank you very much for your excellent question. I think that I will ask Malika to come in first, and then if any of the other ADB colleagues would like to also try to respond to the issues that you've raised. So Malika.
Thank you, Zoni. Let me start and answering the question about the importance of performance indicators and tracking how the benefits of the projects that are of development projects are how the benefits are actually distributed, and if women are equally benefiting from what projects is generating. Yes, when we design projects based on the analysis and understanding the gaps and issues, we require projects, especially for higher gender risk category, for higher gender categories, effective gender mainstreaming and gender equality theme, to include proactive gender designs. And these gender designs have to demonstrate how projects will actually narrow gender gaps and how it address the issues or empower women. So, for example, if we have projects in the infrastructure development, then the access to skills in the executive and implementing agencies, the designs that are related to access to skills in the implementing and executive agencies have to take into account how many women are there in these agencies. What is the current status of the coverage by the training? Are there any potential to bring in more women? And this can be done through various designs. We can bring in people who will be, we can bring in graduates, for example, as a part of the internship programs. And this is very often done, for example, in our private sector operations. We can develop specific training modules that can be accessed as on training, but also establish the systems that would be linking the agencies with the TVET institutions to ensure that women have access to the more in-demand skills. And these are actually indicators that we are tracking as a part of the corporate results framework. We're also using a lot of, and this I think I mentioned in my presentation, so we're also using pilot projects or demonstration projects, especially in the countries where we often see from our counterparts that the response, it's so difficult to bring in people, to bring in women and girls in this area of the training. These demonstration projects it's a small scale project where we'll provide the training, which is not say, not the traditional area for women. Like one of these projects, for example, was in Fiji a couple of years ago, again, where we trained 20 women in construction skills to demonstrate that women can do this work, but they can also find their jobs, to move forward in the construction sector. In terms of the MND indicators, as I also mentioned, the gender action plan is our gender mainstreaming tool, and we are tracking this indicator throughout the project implementation, but also at the project completion to see if this target's been achieved. And it's very important part of the lessons learned. If you look at the project completion reports by ADB, we always have this section that talks about lessons, what were the struggles, and what were the barriers to bring in women into, for example, into training or to achieve other gender-related targets. Okay, and then there was question from Cynthia in terms of the transformative approaches. Yes, we mentioned the transformative approaches, and this is part of the operational plan 2 for operation priority. And we are talking about the different areas of transformative gender agenda aligned with SDG 5. We're talking about bringing women, benefit on ICT development. We're talking about the time poverty, addressing the gender-specific biases and cultural and gender norms. We are also talking about the ensuring the woman in leadership position, and this is done both in infrastructure project, but also in our technical assistance through our technical assistance project, where we're looking beyond something that there is strong appetite from our counterparts on the country level. And very often technical assistance projects help us to lay the ground, to have a foundation to build up the dialogue that can be further taken over through our policy-based lending and through our investment projects. Thank you.
Thanks. And Cynthia, we can put the OP operational plan 2 link in the chat if you would like to have a look at that. I think also Madhu and Zainab would like to respond to your question, Cynthia. So I will ask Madhu and then Zainab to come in. Thank you. And then after that, we'll take a 5-minute break.
Cynthia, thanks for, I'll try to respond to your first question, which was more on the study and that it mentions provisions, whether we have basically seen that observed or studied how those provisions are actually getting implemented. Now, this is a desk review study and it's a benchmarking study. So our aim was to see the kind of provisions that the different MFIs, across the different MFIs, what kind of provisions were used. And that is what is actually presented. We did not go into the details of how they get implemented, but we obviously are in touch with our MFI partners and we do understand the kind of challenges that they face. So that information we have. We also have our experience from our own projects that we see what gets implemented, where we have a lot of difficulty actually in implementing or tracking or monitoring, gender-related impacts or any mitigation measure that we try to implement. Now, but I think we also need to see how ADB is organized, and I think that will be very clear, like the proactive agenda and the aspirational elements of gender are dealt in ADB separately. So our SPS, as also Zena pointed out in her presentation, focuses on the gender risks of a project. So which means adverse impacts related to environment and social safeguards. And some of the institutions, if you see the policies, there is a kind of a mix between these two elements in their policies, also in their safeguard standard. So as also presented in the end in terms of recommendation, and if you have managed to go on through the paper, where we clearly say that some have standalone gender safeguard standards, and some have provisions integrated into the different performance standards. So ADB would want to see, what works for us institutionally, and also what works for the DMCs. Having said that, does not mean that we would equate gender to women. We would equate gender just as an addition. What we are trying to see is assess the risk at the very start of the project in terms of the adverse impacts that might have for the different population groups, and see how, in terms of gender, how disproportionately those impacts are and what the project needs to do. And in order to do that, in order the project to actually assess those risks and mitigate those adverse risks, what kind of provisions our ideal policy should have to protect the rights, not only of women, but anybody, any person who's adversely affected by an ADB project. So bottom line is, we try to, so far, we have always had a very clear distinction between the aspirational development elements and the risk elements. In a project documentation, they all go together. But in terms of, we have made that distinction also just to be sure that we are really addressing those adverse impacts very clearly, and it has a proper documented process, from the start till the end in terms of monitoring, tracking of behavior. Similar is also for the aspirational development element. They also have the gender action plans, the tracking mechanisms. Now, if you look at a project completion report of an ADB, it would document both the how the mitigation measures performed when it comes to the context of negative, and how the aspirational development element for gender worked in a project or what failed. So I just thought that I give you a little bit of background, how things operate internally. So it might be easy for you to understand that it gets its importance, but the approach is a little different. I'll stop here, Zoni, over to you.
Thank you, Madhu. And Zainab, just very briefly, if you would like to come in before we take a break.
Yeah, thanks for the question. Yes, I think as Madhu said, I mean, the benchmarking study at this stage was really based on sort of what is available publicly in terms of information. I mean, we didn't do any sort of in-depth interviews regarding what happens with implementation. However, it is important to also mention that the way gender is increasingly being framed is really much, much more than the traditional early approach of just being part of a vulnerable group or women only and so on. And increasingly, there's emphasis on issues such as obviously human rights type of approach, but also issues such as intersectionality and how gender intersects with other issues, for example. And different institutions have looked at this differently. For example, for the IDB, an important issue is the issue of race and how gender and race interact in the Latin American context. For the EBRD, because they are focused on transforming countries into more market economies, the issue of the role of gender in creating a market economy becomes very important. Also in creating a new democracy becomes very important. So the different institutions have also added other things to sort of the more traditional gender, seeing it as a vulnerable or women's group type issue. So there are experiences from which ADB can also benefit there if there are specific issues related, for instance, to the situation in Asia. I mean, for instance, two areas that are frequently brought in is the situation of gender in conflict and violence context. This is very important, and also increasingly issues such as procurement and how having agreements with contractors to prevent gender-based violence through procurement contracts is also something that is increasingly being done. So, I mean, just the point I'm trying to make is that although we didn't look at details of implementation, but even from just the literature review, there are issues that go beyond the traditional way of looking at gender, which ADB, I think, can benefit from. Thank you.
Thank you very much. I think Azim wanted to come in, so I saw you turn on your camera. Did you want to come in, Azim?
No, I just am.
You just
prepping
turned on your
myself for
camera. Okay.
All
right.
Whenever you're ready, you can hand it over. Yeah.
Okay. Yeah. No. So I think we just we can. It's now 11:40, so we're a little bit behind in terms of our break. But I think if we can take a 5-minute break to let everyone stretch a little bit, and then we'll come back in 5 minutes, if that's okay. Azim?
Thanks very much, Zoni. Yes, and having concluded part 1 of the session, we'll now, as Zonabel said, pause for a 5-minute break. And while we're pausing for that break, we have a few poll evaluation questions coming up a little bit later on. So please think about how effective, how satisfied, and how satiated you are with these dialogues and consultations. We will be asking you for specific inputs in a number of polls coming up, as Zonabel said. So on the next slide, you will see some of the guiding questions we have for part 2 of the Q&A session, which will be moderated once again by Zonabel Woods. And as you will see, the countdown timer in the top right-hand corner, as it goes down to 0, as it ticks away, it'll give you an indication that it's approaching time to return to your screens. We will also be playing some background music, and as that background music fades away, you will also know that it's time to start to return to your screens and resume and reconvene for part 2 of the Q&A session. So for that, we'll take a brief 5-minute break, but I invite you once again to think about your inputs, dialogues, and levels of satisfaction on how these consultations might be improved and whether or not they've addressed your needs, because we'll be asking you that question a bit later on. So with that, we'll see you all in about 5 minutes. Thank you and see you soon. Thanks very much, everybody, and welcome back for part 2 of our open discussion as continued by Zonabel Woods. A reminder once again that you can ask questions through posting them in the chat box or through virtually raising your hand in Zoom in either English, Chinese, Bahasa, Khmer, Lao, or Vietnamese. And a further reminder that if you wish to remain anonymous, please ask your questions in the chat box, but instead of selecting to everyone in the chat, please send a direct message to Jennifer de Bellen or Niel Aquino, or in fact, any other person who you see as a co-host on this Zoom call. They're members of the team working behind the scenes and will repost your question anonymously to protect your identity. And as I mentioned, we have a few event evaluations before we turn you back to Bruce Dunn to give us a wrap up of the next step following the consultations. So I know Zonabel has some questions that she's got queued up. And to facilitate that dialogue and discussion, let me now turn it back over to you, Zonabel.
Thank you very much, Azim. I'm just going to just give me 1 second. I'm just scrolling through some of the questions that we have in our chat box. So welcome back, everybody. Just 1 second. So we have actually a few comments and questions from Mike Veravati. Mike, would you like to come in the chat box? Okay, so if there's no other questions from Mike, we also have received some other questions earlier. If you just give me 1 second, or does anyone would like to put their hand up and ask someone something now? Okay, so we also have some guiding questions, proposed questions for this afternoon. So one of them is regarding, what are the potential relationships between gender and safeguards that we need to be aware of. We've talked a little bit about that. Mary earlier made some points around that, and followed by, are women and girls disproportionately affected by safeguard related issues? I think we've heard about that from a number of the speakers, and in particular, others have raised the issue of including girls and children in that in the discussion as well. We also have a question around where we'd like to get your feedback on in terms of what are some of the elements and challenges of the enabling environment for ensuring implementation of safeguard requirements regarding gender. And lastly, why do gender issues need to be included in the monitoring of gender and safeguards? So those are our guiding questions that we'd like to continue to explore with you in the next next minutes that we have left in this Q&A. So are there any other comments or questions? If not, maybe I can ask Malika to come in earlier. She had responded to a question in the chat box from following up from another comment from Cynthia. So Malika, can I just ask you to briefly come in?
Yes, sorry, I think there is a question from Mike. Okay, so I was just briefly providing some responses on Cynthia's additional comments. So we do have equality requirements for gender indicators, and this is like part of the gender mainstreaming systems. We need to ensure that gender designs that are included, both actions related and the targets related, are following the requirements of SMART indicators. So they have to be specific, measurable, they have to be ambitious, and the time bound. So for training and capacity building related designs, we do not measure participation. So if you look at the project design and monitoring frameworks, you would not see 100 women participated in the training. We really want to measure what is the value addition that we are creating in the project, and what are the knowledge and skills that we are building. Of course, one of the challenges in how we can measure this. So I think most of the project would have the result that will be measured through the pre-training and the post-training surveys, and we will have targets for women who will be reporting that they have a better understanding or they have a better skills. But we also have quite a good number of the project, especially related when we are building the skills on the, for example, business management skills, where we are linking women who will be attending these courses, for example, with financial institutions. So we will be building skills on how to apply for loans with the banks. And then measure how many women would actually have access to loans, or how many women would actually register their business going from informal economy to formal economy. So this is just to answer the question on how we measure the results. And I think this is like really good kind of like example of how we can linkage the success and then benefit and then empower and transform. Thank you.
Thank you, Malika. I believe we have a raised hand from Sri. Sri, if you'd like to come in, please, with your question or your comment.
Yeah, thank you, Joni. Yeah, I think when we talk about gender safeguard, it can be what we call effective or efficient if we not including intersectionality issue, because women or men is not it's not homogeneous. Yeah, there are many variations. So we need to address each issue of the social category. Yeah, I think it should be including on concern seen in design, implementation, and also in monitoring and evaluation, as well as the key performance indicator for measure the achievement or the result of the project that's supported by ADB. And the other issue, I think, when in the implementation in operation, many institutions have the what we call safeguard policy, but usually, but not all who inform or disseminate or to communicate with the staff or the stakeholders that include in their operation. So, and the other issue, the mechanism how to report, how to respond if there is the problem in for example, sexual harassment in the workplace. It's very sensitive, yeah, and I think it should be also considered when ADB want to update the safeguard policy. Thank you.
Thank you very much for your comments. Is this something, Malika, that you can respond to, particularly around, Sri made a comment around SEA, so maybe you can just also speak to the consultations that are happening around SEA?
Thank you. I think I will just touch upon two questions that Sri raised. The first one is intersectionality and how important it is to keep in mind that the woman is not a homogeneous group. We understand that and fully appreciate this, and our gender work is actually looking at the intersectional intersectional issues. So when we do the gender assessment, which is mandatory for all projects, whether it's some gender elements, if it will be some gender elements or effective gender mainstreaming or gender equity theme project, the gender analysis is a mandatory part of the due diligence. And this is where we're looking at overall gender gaps, but also looking at intersectional aspects. And we know that, for example, we cannot really compare the gender inequalities and the gender gaps, for example, between men and women from the better of household and from the poor household, both in terms of access to opportunities, access to resources, and the decision-making power. And this would relate to all the other groups, like women with disabilities, women living in rural areas, or women living in urban areas. So this is very important part of our work, and actually the operational plan 2 is also talks about the importance of paying attention on the gender gaps and the intersectional aspects. The second question that you raised about the sexual harassment. So we will have next week a round of consultation on the proposed approaches on addressing sexual exploitation, abuse, and harassment in safeguards policy, and what we are doing right now in ADB. But just to quickly maybe just touch upon, and I hope you can join the consultation next week. We did a benchmarking study to look at how sexual exploitation, abuse, and harassment is included in other MDB's safeguards policies, and there are different approaches that are used. Inter-American Development Bank is really far ahead of many of MDBs in terms of including very, very clearly and explicitly SERD-related provisions in their policy, both across different standards, but also in a standalone gender standard. And the World Bank, for example, which doesn't have any specific provisions in their safeguard policy and standards, but it's using very actively the good practice note as a guidance document, and the SEA-related measures are included throughout the project cycle, like from the beginning, going through the screening tools and identifying what are the potential risks, and then going through the project design, including the specific provisions in the procurement templates, and ensuring that there is accountability for contractors. And this is something that we are looking at right now and seeing where we can include it in the safeguard policies, in the updated safeguard policy, but also we are designing a good practice note. It's a more of kind of advisory good practice document to provide recommendations for our borrowers, for executive and implementing agencies, and for contractors on how to address, like prevent, mitigate, and respond to risks of sexual exploitation, abuse, and harassment in our project. And this good practice note is specifically looking at the risks that are associated with infrastructure development work, because this is where we're bringing in, big construction camps. There is a disturbance to community. There are higher risks that are related to the labor influx, and so on and so forth. So I hope I answered this question. Thank you.
All right, maybe we can just also in the chat box put the information about next week's consultations on SEA. And so Mike is unfortunately having some issues with their sound, their microphone. So I will just read out their question and comment. So appreciation of ADB's efforts to ensure protection against gender-based violence, particularly sexual violence. My thoughts are that sometimes violence protection policies are not fully supported in the first by ensuring that the gender perspective must be fully realized and implemented as a value in the scope of work or in each sector. How is the safeguard how can the safeguard find to resolve this situation? My addition is that it would be very good that this safeguarding could enable women as a vulnerable group to dare to report violence either as witnesses or as victims themselves, because sometimes they are also in a power relationship and with regards to the patriarchal culture. I think that, yes. So Malika, did you want to respond to this, and also Madhu? Or any follow-up comments to that?
Yes. Madhu, do you want me to start maybe? When we did the study looking at and where EDB is situated, against other MDBs, what we found out is that, while we are really recognized as a pioneer amongst other MDBs in gender space, because we have this well-regarded project gender mainstreaming systems, and we've been doing very active work both through our lending and through our technical assistance project. We're really incorporating gender designs in the policy dialogue through our policy-based lending and through the result-based lending. What we found out is that and this was the result of the benchmarking exercise, that we are kind of falling behind, and we're at risk of falling behind other peer MDBs in the area of established approaches to address sexual exploitation, abuse, and harassment. So we've been working in the area of addressing gender-based violence quite actively, both through the technical assistance project and through other modalities. One of the examples maybe will be in the last 2 years, when we've been supporting governments to address issues that were related to the COVID outbreak through our CSPRU project. Sorry, I don't remember the full name of this project modality. So one of the you probably know, right, that there was a shadow pandemic that was reported by many NGOs, but also many governments, that shadow pandemic of gender-based violence and intimate partner violence that was associated with the lockdown measures. And in many countries, part of the response measures that we discussed and included in the project designs is ensuring that women will have continued access to the hotlines, continuous access to shelters, and women will also have access to resources, like when we do the payments, that's part of the social protection initiative, then women will be the end line beneficiaries. So they will be the one who will be receiving this money. In terms of the patriarchal norms that are like very present in many of our developing member countries, they have to be, and this is a part of the transformative gender agenda. This is something that we've been actively working with our partners on the country level, with many CSOs. We have technical assistance project across many countries. We've been raising awareness. We've been financing behavior change campaigns that would first kind of raise the awareness about the prevalence of the gender-based violence and intimate partner violence, but also establishing systems within institutions on how to respond, on how to mitigate and respond. The sensitivity of sexual violence is really one of the key factors in terms of the access to reporting mechanisms. Like the data suggests that, and this is something that part of the benchmarking exercise was, data suggests that only 7% of women who've been experiencing sexual violence, they actually report to the official sources. And the key barriers to it is that women don't believe that they will be, they don't believe that will be trusted, and that there are risks for re-victimization and retaliation. So this is something that we are planning to address in our forthcoming work through the good practice note that will be approved and that will be piloted in selected countries, but also hopefully it will be addressed in the revised safeguard policy. Thank you. Madhu, over to you.
Thanks, Malika. And I think Malika gave a very good, a background in terms of, what kind of measures that can be adapted actually to manage situations like this. But how would it work in the context of the application of the safeguard policy? As we already mentioned, any risks related to gender risks, CR risks will always be identified at the very early stage of the screening of the project. And that would guide us what kind of measures would be needed. That information would also be overlaid with the data that we get from the contextual risk assessment. Contextual risk assessment would mean what kind of legal provisions are there in the country. What is the, in terms of when you discuss with the CSOs, what kind of things exist, like in terms of barriers like the patriarchal culture that women don't feel comfortable, to speak. So having have a basis of what is the bottom line, what are the baseline in terms of the problems, then we have to work on the solutions. So then further through the process of social impact assessment, we would also find out that what kind of measures that can be adopted in the project to safeguard and protect the rights of people who are sexually exploited, maybe sexually exploited. And the new safeguard policy would also have specific provisions on standards on labor and working conditions to prevent, again, exploitation in any form. We are also planning to have specific provisions for CR risks, but as we know, this is a stakeholder consultation process, and we have to build consensus around all the provisions that we include in the policy. So we would also have to ask our DMC partners how they feel about it, because I think that was one of the questions that was mentioned by Shri in terms of where there are no such regulations, in the country to protect the rights, or, people are not, countries which are not so happy about it, to include provisions in the policy. So this is a negotiation process that we will undertake with our DMC partners in terms of the specific provisions of SEA regarding also gender risk assessment in any project, how to safeguard their rights. So after we have that assessment process, then we will have the way forward. What would be that? That there will be provisions in the contractor's document. There would be also provisions for grievance mechanisms that are established for projects where women or anybody can report any form of violence that has been taking place, and also how ADB's due diligence will be conducted in terms of monitoring those issues. Now, having said that does not necessarily mean that having those GRM and everything would actually encourage women to come in. But what Malika really emphasized was dialogue with the country, as well as awareness building, amongst the various stakeholders about the issue was also very, very important, and how, and also for ADB as an institution, that how strictly we can monitor such forms of violence that might take place in a project. I would stop there. Zoni, over to you.
Yes, thank you. So we have a couple of more questions, and I'm just going to read them out because we're coming to the end of our consultation. One of the questions was from Dr. Professor Shi, I believe, and he asked about how do we work on monitor and evaluation in contexts where women, there's limitations on women, and that they are not able to even speak in public. I believe that was the question. Yes, so how do GAP and MNE in some regions in gender sensitive difficulties such as women were not to appear in the public areas? And then we have another question regarding how we engage with LGBTI communities, particularly most marginalized transgender people. How are they supported by ADB? And whether when we mention women and girls, whether we include women of all gender identities, including transgender women. So I will ask Malika to come in, and as well as Bruce, with regards to SOGI and safeguards discussions that are happening also next week or the week after. So I will just hand it over to Malika first.
Thank you. Yeah, first of all, I think it's again very important to mention that we look at gender issues from intersectional perspective. We need to ensure that women also participate in all discussion that related to SOGI. When we talk about gender equality and women's empowerment, we include women in all their identities. There was a question, like if we look at transgender women, of course we do. So in some of our countries, there is a very strong push from the governments to include social inclusion and SOGI inclusion as part of our gender work. In our DMCs, there is a still challenge to bring these issues into discussion, and this would require, like, again, as I mentioned before, like more of awareness raising and policy dialogue in terms of reaching an understanding. Sorry, it's just continue to switch off. Sorry, and in building dialogue and reaching an understanding of importance of addressing these issues and level of prevalence. Of course, there are there are also limitations in terms of including SOGI related issues as a part of the compliance work, because being a gender specialist, I think someone already raised the question. So what do we do? How we can ensure that the women voices are heard, right, during the consultations if women, for example, are not allowed to be in the public spaces. So in many countries, the issues in terms of understanding these issues, the issues that are faced by SOGI persons, understanding the gaps that can be addressed within the projects can be limited, because we will not be able to have a meaningful consultation. We will, like, even inviting these people to consultation process might be a challenge. So we are aware of these limitations, and this is something that we continue to discuss, both internally, but also with our developing member countries. So this will be a part of the consultations in 2 weeks period after the consultation on sexual exploitation, abuse and harassment. We also prepared a benchmarking study that will be shared, and I hope we will be able to answer more questions during that meeting. Thank you.
Thank you, Malika. And over to you, Bruce, if you would like to add to this question, but also it's our last question for this Q&A time together. So if you wanted to add any other last comments as well.
Great, thanks very much, Sonny, and thank you so much for those final questions. On the sexual orientation and gender identity issues, I won't add so much now. I think that Malika has covered it clearly, but I just want to reinforce again that we certainly do need to look at intersectionality issues. And I think, as one of the earlier comments from, I think it was Cynthia McDougall had mentioned as well, gender in the current context as we understand it not being binary, and the need to also consider people of different sexual orientation, gender identity, for example, transgender people. So that's something that we're looking at to include as part of the new safeguards framework. Malika has mentioned the upcoming consultations on that, which will be on the 6th and 7th of June. And there's a background paper there that we expect to be released actually today or tomorrow. It's in the process of just the publication at the moment. So that's upcoming. And we look forward to your engagement in that process as well. Now, I won't make any further comments because I'll have an opportunity with final remarks to sum up a little bit. So I'll pass back to you, Sonny. Thank you.
Okay, thank you very much, everyone, for your questions, for engaging with us this afternoon, and for your time in this afternoon's or this morning's consultation. I don't have much to add, so I think it's my job, if I'm understanding it correctly, to hand it over to Azim to take us through the remaining of the program. So thank you very much to everyone for your participation.
Thanks, Sonibel, and Malika, Zainab, Madhu, as well as Bruce and others for including the events management and SCP teams, who of course have worked tirelessly behind the scenes. A warm and heartfelt thanks to you all, but of course, a special and huge thanks to you, our participants and informants, for raising your insightful comments, the clarity of your questions, the sharing of your experiences, and the constructive feedback. I want to reiterate that the comments on the study on gender in Asia and the Pacific that we've received from this consultation will be considered in the final study report, which will in turn inform the revision of ADB standard and the updating of the safeguards policy statement. But please don't go just yet. As I mentioned previously, we want your feedback, and we've got a quick Zoom poll for you right now that's up on your screen. Please rate your satisfaction with today's session, ranging from 1 to 5. And if we could quickly have that, just tap in a number between 1 and 5 on how satisfied you are with today's consultation. And that should be a very quick, almost impulsive type of reactionary poll to your initial impressions on today. We also want to gauge some deeper feedback and solicit some deeper comment on how we can improve the levels of these consultations. And we've got 2 additional polls, the links to which are both in the chat box now. The first is a mentee poll, which gives you the opportunity to think a bit deeper and provide us 3 or 4 or 5 sentences on how we can actually improve the level of engagement, the level of discourse, and the consultations in these particular sessions. So if you have specific ideas on how we can improve the level of engagement with you, we'd be very happy to hear from you, positively or otherwise, on how these consultations could be improved. We really need that input and feedback. Despite the few numbers of consultations we have left, we're always able to respond very quickly and adapt to your needs. So that's what we want to hear. And then of course, we have the post-event survey, which gives us an opportunity to understand, after these ideas have percolated and settled in, what are your impressions of the way these consultations have been conducted and the level of satisfaction that you have upon further reflection. But for now, let's go back to the quick Zoom poll, and I'd like to wrap it up in the next 10 seconds. Oh, here we have it. Excellent. So we have 100% rating this consultation as a 4 or better. We understand and we're grateful and appreciative of this feedback, but we also understand that there's room for improvement. There always is. This is not perfect in terms of a scientific approach to consultation. And so we're happy to tweak these consultations and modify them to your specific needs. We want to know what those specific needs are, and the 2 opportunities that you have for responding specifically to how we can alter and improve these consultations are linked in the chat box now. So feel free to respond to those when you have the time. Those polls will be open at least for the next day. Thank you all once again for your feedback and participation. I'm now going to bring you back to the Director of SDCC and this overall process, Mr. Bruce Dunn, to give us a brief summary of what we've heard and to walk us through the next steps after this consultation. So Bruce, could you please review the discussions and take us through the next steps?
Okay, thank you very much, Azim. And a huge thanks to everyone that's joined today. Of course, in addition to my colleagues, there's been some excellent points, really important issues for us to consider. And I have a wealth of notes that I've taken. But of course, we will also be going through the consultation transcript and making a fuller summary. let me try to just briefly summarize the rich points that have been made now. I have about 10 main points, and then I'll speak very briefly just about some of the next steps. Firstly, just to reiterate that we do see that gender is a fundamental issue, clearly for ADB operations, and that's why it's actually one of the key operational priorities for ADB Strategy 2030 and linked to our corporate results framework. But it's a critical issue for us to strengthen in the context of the new safeguards. We need a clearer, stronger standard, key principles, requirements, and indicators, but importantly, we need to focus more on the implementation side. We need to, as part of that, integrate gender, of course, not just as a key focus in itself, but integrated across the key standards around areas like environmental and social assessment, strengthening also the contextual risk analysis, but linking it very clearly to some of the critical issues like on climate change, on labour, community health and safety, resettlement. We have to look at the gender dimensions appropriately in all of those areas. We've also heard very much in this consultation the need for a proactive and a transformative approach, which of course needs to target country levels where we work, but also down to project level design and then to the project safeguards to address any residual risks to people. I'll come back to that point in a few moments, but this is something where you've heard in this consultation that ADB has this proactive agenda and a whole range of processes that we undertake there, which of course goes beyond the safeguards, but there is the space where there is linkage to the safeguards as well. So we need to look, I think, in the next stages around that intersection quite carefully. Another issue I heard from a number of people was the need for us to move just, let's say, beyond the current context, approach, and norms. The issue of intersectionality has come up a number of times. We need to look at the relationships between gender with, say, for example, poverty, disability, ethnicity, Indigenous peoples' rights issues. So there's a range of issues there. Also the recognition that gender is not binary. The focus on women's and girls is there, but we also need to consider people of different sexual orientation and gender identity. That's something we're doing. And as I mentioned, we've got a consultation coming up on that topic on the 6th and 7th of June. A few other points to mention. The inclusion component is something that needs to be enhanced through the stakeholder engagement process and consultations. We, at the moment, the existing policy, of course, has inclusion of gender issues in consultations, but there's some weakness around the preparation of stakeholder engagement plans and targeting those appropriately. So that needs to be strengthened for the inclusion of women, of youth, children. We need to also look at things like the consultation modalities and the timing. Plus, we had mentioning of enhancement in terms of focus on the documentation, on indicators, and on the monitoring and evaluation frameworks. So there's a lot to do there around that issue. The processes of consultation and of course considering gender issues is also something that needs to start early. It needs to be part of the project preparation and then proceed through, if it's a construction civil works project, obviously the construction stage, but importantly also the operations. And there may be gender differentiated issues and risks to manage throughout those various different stages. Another topic was around gender-based violence and sexual exploitation, abuse and harassment issues. You've heard from my colleague Malika that this is an important area where ADB is doing more work, development of draft guidelines, but we'll be considering this in the context of the safeguards. We need to do more in terms of the risk assessment, taking into consideration these risks into project design, building awareness of the project itself and those involved in it, and of course measures really need to avoid these risks where possible, but of course, where issues do occur, we need to be able to support through having safe and accessible grievance redress mechanisms, things like access to hotlines, to shelters, and really a survivor-focused approach. This is something that's come out a lot from the review of good practices. And again, we will be doing further consultations here next week, actually, from the 24th of May. And there's a separate background paper. Another issue we heard about was around the consideration of child rights and differentiated impacts and risks to girls and boys. There's a range of issues there around child health and safety, risks of child labor, risks of sexual exploitation and harassment, but also, of course, how inclusion through stakeholder engagement processes can help improve the project design. So there's a lot of things that we need to work through and consider, and ultimately in a new policy, it'll be about implementation. That's going to have to be supported by additional guidance, training, follow-up on the ground, monitoring, but I would say really importantly is the capacity building of our borrowers and clients, and this was also mentioned by some of you. Okay, now moving a little bit to some of the next steps. Obviously, we have all of these issues that we need to work through and think about how this will affect the policy and the implementation process. And there's a number of issues where the proactive approach is there in ADB strategies and operational priorities. The safeguards are being updated, but the space in between, how we work between the proactive approach on equality and inclusion versus the more risk management approach on safeguards, I think we have to work together to look at the details there. Now, in the coming months, we will be taking these recommendations and points that you've raised in this consultation and other consultations into some next steps. We're documenting and we'll be releasing further updates of the background papers that we've prepared already based on the consultation findings. We will be feeding those into the preparation of the draft standards. We're expecting at this stage to be able to release a full draft of the standards later in the year, perhaps by about September or October, if we can stay on track there. And in the meantime, we will be going into another stage of consultations. So far, we've been doing these thematic studies and regional consultations, but over the next 3 months, we'll be following up with some country consultations. We'll be either traveling or doing some hybrid consultations to about 10 countries in the next 3 months. And that will include consultations with our developing member countries, but also with civil society, domestic civil society organizations in those countries. And then a special feature in some countries will be some consultations with project affected people, looking at a series of projects that have either been completed or under implementation. And that will actually allow us to do some gender differentiated consultations on how the implementation has gone. That was a question that was raised earlier. So, there's a lot of work still for us to complete this process. We're trying to make it robust. And, ultimately, we really appreciate you joining these consultations and, really contributing as partners in the process to make better safeguards for ADB. So thanks again for joining, and we'll look forward to meeting you in future consultations. So till then, stay safe and take care. Thank you.
Thank you, everyone.